Ma'am, what are you doing on this property?
This is my home. I'm watering my garden.
I need ID. You don't look like you live here.
Officer, I do live here. I'm Judge Patricia Williams.
Yeah, we'll see about that.
The security camera footage tells the whole story. The timestamp reads 7:23 a.m. on a quiet Tuesday in September. Judge Patricia Williams, still in her comfortable morning robe, was watering the flowers in her front garden when a police cruiser roared into her driveway. What happened next would shock the nation and ultimately cost the city $750,000, making it one of the most expensive lawsuits for mistaken identity and racial profiling in modern history. Judge Patricia Williams had served on the federal bench for 12 years. She was a jurist respected by her colleagues, feared by the criminals who entered her courtroom, and known throughout the legal community for her sharp intellect and unwavering commitment to justice. At 54, she lived in an upscale, predominantly white neighborhood where she had owned her home for nearly 2 decades. It was a beautiful colonial-style house with an impeccably manicured landscape, which she tended to herself every morning before heading to the courthouse. That Tuesday morning was no different. Patricia woke at 6 a.m., made coffee, and went outside to water her flower beds, mentally preparing for a busy day of hearings. She was dressed in gray sweatpants and an old law school t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Nothing about her appearance suggested she held one of the most powerful positions in the American judicial system. Officer Leroy Brown had been patrolling the neighborhood for about 3 hours when he received the call that would change his life. A resident had reported a suspicious person wandering through the affluent community, claiming the individual looked out of place and might be casing homes for a burglary. The caller described a black woman in casual attire, moving between properties. Here, the first insidious thread of the story was woven. Judge Williams's neighborhood had reported 0 burglaries in the past year. The crime rate was so low that most officers considered it a cushy assignment. But Officer Brown approached the call with a fatal bias. He saw Patricia in her front yard and immediately decided she was the person from the anonymous tip. Without running the address through his system, without checking property records, and without a shred of evidence of any actual wrongdoing, he hit his lights and pulled aggressively into her driveway. Patricia, who had been admiring her roses, looked up, puzzled by the police car in her drive. She walked toward the officer with a friendly smile, assuming there had been an incident in the neighborhood and he needed to ask a few questions. She had no idea she was about to become the target of the most humiliating experience of her professional life. Officer Brown exited his vehicle with an immediately confrontational stance. He didn't introduce himself or explain his presence. Instead, he demanded to know what she was doing in the neighborhood. Still confused, Patricia explained that she was watering the flowers in her own yard. Officer Brown glanced at the house, then back at her, his expression making it clear he didn't believe a word of it. He demanded she prove she lived there. Patricia was stunned by the question. Standing in her own front yard, in her pajamas, holding a watering can. The situation was surreal. She gestured to the house behind her and said, "This is my home." Brown shook his head, stating he needed to see identification and proof of residence. Who among us has ever been interrogated by the police for doing something so mundane on their own property? What happened next was even more unbelievable. Patricia went inside to retrieve her identification, assuming it would clear up the misunderstanding quickly. She returned with her driver's license, which clearly listed the address of the very house they were standing in front of. She also grabbed a piece of mail from the kitchen counter, which also bore her name and address. Any reasonable person, upon seeing this, would have realized their mistake and apologized. But Officer Brown was not done. He looked at the ID and said it could be fake. He examined the mail and suggested it could be stolen. His demeanor grew more hostile, and Patricia began to understand this wasn't a simple mistake. It was something far more sinister. Maintaining her composure, she asked Officer Brown why he was questioning her on her own property. She asked if a crime had been reported in the area. He told her about the suspicious person call and said she fit the description. Patricia pressed him, asking what, exactly, was suspicious about watering flowers in her own front yard. Brown claimed she had appeared nervous and evasive. It was at this moment that Patricia made a critical decision. She took out her cell phone and began recording. The second the camera was on him, Officer Brown's attitude shifted dramatically. He ordered her to put the phone away. She calmly stated that she had the right to record their interaction. He countered that he was an officer on duty in a public space. Brown moved closer, invading her personal space, claiming her recording was interfering with his investigation. Patricia asked what, exactly, he was investigating, since she had already provided proof of residence. Brown said he still wasn't convinced she belonged in the neighborhood and needed to conduct a more thorough investigation. Then came another stunning turn. Patricia decided to play her card. She informed Officer Brown that she was a federal judge and that his conduct was entirely inappropriate. She expected this revelation to end the confrontation immediately, perhaps with an apology. Instead, Officer Brown laughed. He actually laughed in her face. He scoffed. If you were a federal judge, you'd be in a suit, not out here watering flowers in your old clothes. He told her he didn't believe her, claiming it was just another lie she was telling to get out of trouble. Patricia couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had just told this officer her profession, and he had called her a liar to her face. She offered to show him her judicial credentials, but Brown said those could be fake, too. He was committed to his narrative that she was a criminal, despite all evidence to the contrary. The situation escalated when Brown announced he was going to search her property for evidence of a crime. Patricia stood firm, telling him he had no right to search her property. Without a warrant, he had no authority to enter her home. She explained that he had neither probable cause nor any evidence of a crime. Brown replied that her refusal to cooperate was making her look even more guilty. By now, neighbors were beginning to notice the commotion. Several people came outside to see what was happening. Patricia recognized a few of them as longtime neighbors who knew exactly who she was. She called out to Mrs. Henderson, who lived 3 houses down, and asked her to confirm that she had lived in the neighborhood for nearly 20 years. Mrs. Henderson came over and told Officer Brown that Patricia was indeed a longtime resident and a federal judge, and that he was making a terrible mistake. Brown dismissed Mrs. Henderson's testimony, stating that neighbors sometimes lie to cover for each other. He was digging himself into an indefensible hole. What happened next was captured on multiple cameras and became the key evidence in a lawsuit that would cost the city more than most people earn in a lifetime. Officer Brown made a decision that would end his career and expose a pattern of behavior that had been ignored for far too long. Before we continue, what Judge Patricia Williams was about to endure would test every ounce of her judicial temperament and forever change her view of the justice system she had dedicated her life to serving. Officer Brown called for backup, claiming he had a suspicious and uncooperative individual who was providing a false identity. Within minutes, 2 more patrol cars arrived at Patricia's home. Officers Sarah Martinez and David Chin stepped out and immediately sensed something was wrong. Officer Martinez approached Patricia calmly and asked what was going on. Patricia explained how she had been watering her flowers when Officer Brown began questioning her without cause and showed her the ID and mail. Martinez looked at the evidence, at the house, and then at Patricia, her expression making it clear she knew they were in deep trouble. Officer Chin went to speak with Brown, asking in a low voice what had initiated the stop. Brown explained the suspicious person call, but when Chin pressed him on what specific actions Patricia had taken that were suspicious, Brown's answers became vague and contradictory. As a 15-year veteran of the force, Chin could see this stop had gone completely off the rails. Meanwhile, more neighbors had gathered. Patricia's next-door neighbor, Robert Kim, a lawyer who had known her for over a decade, came out. He immediately approached Officer Martinez and offered a detailed character reference for Patricia, explaining her role as a federal judge and her standing in the community. But Officer Brown would not back down. Despite the mounting evidence that he had made a catastrophic error, he doubled down. He told the other officers that Patricia was lying and that her story was full of holes. He said her casual attire and early morning activities were suspicious for someone claiming to be a federal judge. It was then that Officer Martinez made a decision that would later be praised by investigators and civil rights attorneys. She pulled Brown aside and told him directly that he needed to terminate the interaction immediately. She said they had overwhelming proof that Patricia was who she said she was, and that continuing would only make things worse. Brown refused to listen. He said he was going to contact the federal courthouse to verify her identity. Martinez pointed out that they were standing in front of a house that belonged to Patricia according to multiple forms of identification, that neighbors were vouching for her, and that there was absolutely no sign of criminal activity. This entire exchange between the officers was captured on Patricia's phone. She remained remarkably calm throughout, but inside, her mind was racing, processing the profound implications of this event. As a federal judge, she had seen countless cases of police misconduct and racial profiling, but to experience it firsthand was something else entirely. Officer Chen approached Patricia and apologized for the situation. He said they would be leaving shortly and she could go about her morning. Patricia thanked him for his professionalism but made it clear that Officer Brown's conduct was unacceptable and would not be ignored. That's when Brown made his final, fatal mistake. He told Officer Chen he wasn't satisfied and that he was going to arrest Patricia for obstruction of justice. He claimed she had interfered with his investigation by recording him and refusing to comply with his demands. Chen looked at him in disbelief and told him it would be the worst decision of his career. But Brown was beyond reason. He walked over to Patricia, announced she was under arrest, and moved toward her with handcuffs. A collective gasp went through the crowd of neighbors. Mrs. Henderson began to cry. Robert Kim immediately started recording on his own phone, shouting that Brown was making a colossal mistake. Patricia stood her ground, stating clearly that she was not resisting, but that Officer Brown was violating her constitutional rights. She said he had no probable cause and that he would face serious consequences for arresting a federal judge on her own property without cause. Officer Martinez physically stepped between Brown and Patricia. She told Brown she would not allow him to make the arrest. She said the situation was out of control and that arresting Patricia would not only destroy his career, but could implicate everyone present. The tension between the officers was palpable. Brown ignored Martinez and reached for Patricia's arm. The moment he made physical contact, Patricia stated clearly that she did not consent to be touched and was being unlawfully detained. She demanded he state the specific crime he believed she had committed. Obstruction of justice and disorderly conduct, he said. Patricia asked how watering her garden constituted disorderly conduct and how providing her ID and complying with his requests constituted obstruction. Brown had no logical answer for either question, but he was still trying to cuff her. At that point, Officer Chen took physical action. He grabbed Brown's arm and told him to stop. Chen said he would not be a party to arresting an innocent woman, let alone a federal judge, on her own front lawn. The standoff between the officers was a moment the neighbors would never forget. Patricia used the moment to make one last appeal to reason. She told the three officers that she understood mistakes happen, but Brown's refusal to acknowledge the obvious was turning a simple misunderstanding into a federal civil rights violation. If they arrested her, she said, the consequences would extend far beyond Officer Brown's career. Brown finally released Patricia's arm, but he wasn't finished. He told her he was writing her a citation for disorderly conduct and that she would have to appear in court. Patricia glanced at the ticket and saw that Brown had filled it out with incorrect information, including the wrong address and an inaccurate description of the supposed incident. She pointed out the errors to Officer Martinez, who examined the citation and shook her head in weary resignation. Martinez told Brown the ticket was invalid and legally worthless. She said writing a false citation could bring additional charges against him. Brown crumpled up the ticket and threw it on Patricia's lawn. After nearly 45 minutes of harassment, the three officers finally left. Patricia stood in her driveway, surrounded by supportive neighbors, clutching the cell phone that contained the video evidence of it all. She knew that her routine morning had just provided the foundation for a lawsuit that would send shockwaves through the city's police department. But the story of Judge Patricia Williams and Officer Brown was far from over. Her next moves would uncover a pattern of misconduct that had been hidden for years and would ultimately cost the city far more than just money. It would cost careers, reputations, and force a complete overhaul of training and accountability for the entire police force. Back inside, Patricia immediately began documenting everything while it was fresh in her mind. She wrote down the exact timeline, the direct quotes from Officer Brown, and a detailed description of each officer's behavior. She uploaded the video to multiple cloud storage accounts and sent copies to her personal email. As a federal judge, she knew better than anyone how easily evidence could disappear or be challenged in court. But she didn't stop there. She called her old friend and colleague, Judge Robert Harrison, who served with her in the same federal district court. Harrison, who had known Patricia for over 15 years, was appalled. He advised her to contact the FBI's Civil Rights Division immediately, as Brown's actions constituted a blatant violation of federal civil rights law. Less than 2 hours after the incident, Patricia had filed complaints with 5 different agencies. She contacted the City Police Department's Internal Affairs Division, the State Police Oversight Board, the FBI's Civil Rights Division, the Department of Justice, and the local district attorney's office. She was leaving no stone unturned, ensuring this could not be dismissed with a simple reprimand or swept under the rug. The response was swift and unprecedented. By that afternoon, FBI agents were at Patricia's home interviewing her. They reviewed her video evidence and took statements from every neighbor who had witnessed the event. Agent Lisa Rodriguez, who specialized in police misconduct cases, told Patricia that in her 20 years in federal law enforcement, Brown's behavior was one of the most egregious cases of racial profiling she had ever seen. But here, the story took an even more disturbing turn. The FBI's investigation into Officer Brown quickly revealed a pattern of misconduct that had been systematically buried by his department for over 6 years. Brown had 43 complaints filed against him in his career, 31 of which involved racial profiling or excessive force against minorities. The department's Internal Affairs Division had either dismissed the complaints, labeling the complainants as unreliable, or given Brown the lightest possible disciplinary action. They claimed there was insufficient evidence or ruled that Brown's actions were within department policy. The FBI discovered that Brown had already cost the city over $200,000 in previous settlements, all of which included non-disclosure agreements to keep his misconduct out of the public eye. Agent Rodriguez found that Brown had a specific MO, targeting well-dressed African Americans in affluent neighborhoods. He had stopped a black surgeon leaving his own clinic, claiming he looked suspicious. He had detained a black professor on his own university campus, saying he didn't belong there. He had even arrested an off-duty black police officer from another jurisdiction who was visiting family. Each incident followed the same script. Brown would approach with suspicion, refuse to accept identification or explanations, escalate the situation with aggressive behavior, and then file a report that painted the victim as uncooperative or threatening. And despite overwhelming evidence of a clear pattern, the department had backed his story every single time. Patricia learned that Officer Martinez had actually filed 3 separate complaints about Brown's behavior over the past 2 years. Martinez had witnessed Brown use excessive force during a traffic stop and had reported his inappropriate comments about minority suspects. All of her complaints had been dismissed by a supervisor who claimed there was insufficient evidence. The investigation also revealed that Brown had just completed a specialized training course on racial bias and constitutional policing 6 months before his encounter with Patricia. He had scored poorly on the training assessment and had told other officers he found the training unnecessary and worthless. Ever wonder how an officer like Brown keeps his job after repeated complaints? The answer lies in a system designed to protect police from accountability, not to protect citizens from police misconduct. The investigation widened when the FBI discovered Brown wasn't acting alone. His direct supervisor, Sergeant Michael Foster, had been actively covering up Brown's misconduct for years. Foster had altered incident reports to remove language that suggested racial profiling, coached Brown on how to write reports that would survive scrutiny, and intimidated witnesses who tried to file complaints. Foster had also assigned Brown to patrol communities with higher minority populations, effectively using him as a tool to harass and intimidate residents that some in the community considered undesirable. The FBI uncovered emails between Foster and Brown where they discussed which areas needed more aggressive policing and what types of people should be viewed with extra suspicion. The scandal reached the highest levels when investigators found that Police Chief William Morrison had been briefed on the pattern of complaints against Brown on multiple occasions and had chosen to do nothing meaningful. Morrison was more concerned with avoiding negative press than with addressing the blatant misconduct in his department. He had actively blocked attempts by reform-minded officers to implement better oversight procedures. He had denied requests for body cameras, opposed the creation of a civilian review board, and consistently lobbied against transparency measures that could have exposed officers like Brown years earlier. Patricia's case became the catalyst for a federal investigation that ultimately put the entire police department under a microscope. The Department of Justice launched a pattern or practice investigation to determine if the department was systematically violating the civil rights of minority residents through discriminatory policing practices. 3 weeks after the incident, Officer Brown was arrested at his home by federal agents. He was charged with deprivation of rights under color of law, a federal felony that carried a sentence of up to 10 years in prison. The indictment specifically cited his pattern of targeting minority citizens and his abuse of police authority to intimidate and harass innocent people. Sergeant Foster was arrested the same day for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. The FBI found he had destroyed evidence related to previous complaints against Brown and had falsified official documents to protect him from accountability. Foster was facing up to 20 years in federal prison if convicted on all charges. Chief Morrison resigned in disgrace before he could be fired, but his resignation did not shield him from the ongoing federal investigation. Federal prosecutors were examining whether his deliberate indifference to civil rights violations constituted criminal conspiracy. Morrison's 25-year career in law enforcement ended not with a retirement party, but with him hiring a criminal defense attorney. The city's response was swift and expensive. Within a month of the FBI arrests, the city offered Patricia a $750,000 settlement. The city's attorneys knew they had no defense against her claims and wanted to settle the case quickly to limit further damage to the city's reputation and finances. But Patricia wasn't interested in a quick settlement that let the city off the hook. She wanted systemic change to prevent other citizens from enduring what she had. Her lawsuit demanded not only monetary damages, but also comprehensive police reform, including mandatory body cameras, the establishment of a civilian oversight board, anti-bias training, and a transparent complaint process. At first, the city resisted her demands for reform, hoping they could simply pay her off. But that resistance crumbled when Patricia's legal team released portions of the FBI investigation that revealed the extent of the cover-up. Local media began reporting on Brown's history of misconduct and the department's systemic failures. The public outrage was swift and fierce. Citizens who had never paid attention to police accountability suddenly understood that their tax dollars had been protecting an officer who violated people's constitutional rights. City council meetings became fiery forums where residents demanded answers as to how Brown had been allowed to continue his abuse for years. The political pressure became unbearable when other victims of Brown's behavior began to come forward publicly. The non-disclosure agreements that had kept them silent were no longer effective now that the FBI investigation had made his pattern of behavior a matter of public record. Patricia's case had opened the floodgates of accountability that had been sealed for years. But the full consequences of that Tuesday morning on her front lawn were still unfolding, and they would ultimately reshape the entire city's approach to police accountability and civil rights. The settlement negotiations dragged on for months, but Patricia's legal strategy was brilliant. Instead of accepting the city's initial offer, she used the media attention to build public pressure for comprehensive reform. Every week brought a new revelation about Brown's misconduct, and each one made the city's position more untenable. Patricia's lawyer, Maria Santos, was a civil rights expert who had won major settlements against police departments across the country. She understood that this case represented an opportunity to create lasting change, not just to win a payout for her client. She strategically leaked information to reporters, organized press conferences with other victims, and built a coalition of community groups that all demanded reform. The breakthrough came when Santos discovered that the city had actually been paying Officer Brown overtime to conduct special patrols in minority neighborhoods. The FBI found records showing that Brown was specifically requested for these assignments because his supervisors believed his aggressive approach would intimidate residents and reduce complaints about other issues like noise or loitering. This was proof that Brown's racial profiling was not just tolerated by the department, it was actively encouraged and financially rewarded. The city had been paying him extra to violate people's constitutional rights. When this information became public, the political fallout was immediate and devastating. 3 city council members called for the entire police leadership to resign. The mayor, who had initially defended the department, suddenly announced he was in favor of comprehensive police reform. Local businesses began threatening to relocate, citing liability and reputational concerns if the city didn't address its policing problem. The federal judge assigned to Patricia's lawsuit, ironically named Judge Brown, no relation to the disgraced officer, made it clear in a hearing that he was not satisfied with the city's response to the systemic issues the case had revealed. He stated that a monetary settlement alone would be insufficient to address the constitutional violations that had occurred. Patricia testified before the city council about her experience and its broader implications. She spoke of the psychological trauma of being treated like a criminal on her own front lawn, but more importantly, she highlighted how her status and resources had protected her in a way that most citizens could not access. She pointed out that if she had not been a federal judge with legal knowledge, connections, and financial resources, Officer Brown's misconduct would have likely been dismissed, just like all the others before it. Her case, she argued, was proof that the system was broken for everyone and that meaningful reform was necessary to protect all citizens, regardless of their status or background. The emotional impact of her testimony was amplified when other victims spoke at the same hearing. A young college student described being arrested by Brown while walking home from the library. A small business owner explained how Brown had harassed his customers outside his shop, driving away business and threatening his family's livelihood. And so, a quiet morning that began in Judge Patricia Williams's garden ended with a $750,000 lesson in accountability for an entire city. Officer Brown lost his career and faced federal charges. The city implemented sweeping police reforms, and Patricia proved that when people refuse to be silent, justice may be delayed, but it will not be denied. Her case stands as one of the clearest indictments of injustice, a stark reminder that the fight for equality often begins on our own front lawns.